My name is Bruce Caldwell. I'm the director of the Center for the History of Political Economy, and I'd like to welcome you to another talk in the Hayek Lecture Series. The series is made possible through a grant from the Thomas Smith Foundation and is sponsored by three groups on campus: the Center, which I direct, the Joint UNC Duke PP&E program, and the Duke Program in American Values and Institutions. Our speaker today is Professor John Taylor, who is the Mary and Robert Raymond Professor of Economics at Stanford University. He's also the George Shultz Senior Fellow in Economics at the Hoover Institution. Professor Taylor received a BA in Economics, summa cum laude, from Princeton University, his PhD from Stanford University. He's a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the Econometric Society, and has served as the Vice President of the American Economics Association. Professor Taylor's academic fields of expertise are macroeconomics, monetary economics, and international economics. He's known for his research on the foundations of modern monetary theory and policy, which has been applied by central banks and financial market analysts around the world. Think the Taylor rule. Professor Taylor has served twice on the President's Council of Economic Advisors. From 2001 to 2005, he served as Under Secretary of Treasury for International Affairs, where he was responsible for currency markets, trade and financial services, foreign investment, international debt and development, and oversight of the IMF and the World Bank. His book, Global Financial Warriors, the Untold Story of International Finance in the Post-9/11 World, chronicles his years as head of the International Division at the Treasury. Professor Taylor has published books and articles in professional journals that are too numerous to mention. I'll just mention his latest book, copies of which will be available, as you saw as you came in, for purchase and signing in the lobby. Title of that book is First Principles, 5 Keys to Restoring America's Prosperity. And this was a book that won the 2012 Hayek Book Award. This afternoon, Professor Taylor will speak on a theme that's very close to my own heart, I must say. The title of his talk is Why We Still Need to Read Hayek. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much, Bruce, and thanks for inviting me. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it. I am not an expert in Hayek by any means, but what I thought I'd do here is, based on my own work and recent thinking, is to kind of explain why I think we can benefit a tremendous amount from reading Hayek. And I have, and I kind of want to explain that, if you like, in my own way. Just as a sort of a brief background, I've almost always been interested in public policy from the point of view of rules, rule of law, monetary policy in particular, this so-called Taylor rule. And it actually began very early for me in college. I was an undergraduate at Princeton and had the opportunity to work with a young assistant professor at the time, Phil Howry. Phil was a graduate of Duke. 1959 bachelor's degree. He went, I think his PhD was NC State, and then he was assistant professor at Princeton. Time series analyst, very much interested in policy. So I took a course from him and learned about macroeconomics in a way which most people don't. We didn't do static SI, SLM. It was all spectral analysis and time series. But the focus was because of this dynamic system you had. The economy was a dynamic system, dynamic stochastic. We sometimes know dynamic stochastic general equilibrium. But that was kind of like the way I was taught. And when you think about monetary policy or fiscal policy in a way of thinking like that, you're automatically drawn to contingency plans, rules, because just a statement of what you're going to do tomorrow is not enough to analyze the policy. You have to sort of see how it interacts with the whole economy. So very early on for me, I got interested in policy rules, monetary policy rules, and fiscal policy rules. And it was motivated really just because that's what you had to do. That's what the world was like. You just couldn't do it any other way. And basically, much of my career have followed in that particular mode. And of course, that brings us into rules versus discretion and all the things that have happened over time. But what I've noticed in analyzing recent events and sort of going back and thinking of, and maybe even 50 years, is this idea of rules and rule of law is kind of part of a set of broader principles. And what I wanted to do when we get the slides back is explain how I've sort of broadened that thinking beyond just monetary policy, but more broadly, okay? So how does that get to Hayek? Well, as you know, Hayek wrote a lot about rule of law. It's really, in effect, you know, the Constitution of Liberty is about the rule of law. Much about the Road to Serfdom is focused on the importance of rules of law. And it was only partly, as I've found out over time, partly because he felt that was a better way to do policy. Much of it had to do with a broader political role. Rules were rule of law, an important way to preserve individual freedom. Okay, and so what I really want to do today is talk about really beginning with the economics, pure why it's good from an economic perspective to stress rule of law, predictability, policy rules. And then I'm going to argue that we need to we're not really there now, we've kind of drifted away in public policy in the United States and in Europe. And so the idea is by thinking about how Hayek developed these ideas, maybe he can help us get back. By reading him, it can help us get back. And so that's what I would like to do in these few minutes. So I'm going to sort of anticipate the charts will come in a few minutes. So let's start where we are now in, say, the U.S. economy. We are 4 years into a recovery from a very deep recession. It has been very slow certainly by my expectation, 2% growth roughly on average since the recession ended. This is very different from the expansion in the 1980s, which was much more rapid than now. You can see that in different ways. It was sort of an equally deep recession in the early 80s. We came out of it with growth almost more than twice as high, so 5–6% compared to the 2% now. And you can see this vividly in the charts, which you can't see, I know the charts, but you can see this vividly. You don't have to take my word for it, so to speak. This has also led to other problems, like it's one of the reasons why unemployment has remained high. And it tends to be, once unemployment stays high for a while, you kind of get used to it, and so people stop talking about it as much, but it's still really a problem, especially some parts of the country. My state, California, is 9.5%, New Jersey, 9.5%. And it's certain 15% in the Central Valley of California, 28% in the South. We're tending to not talk about this as much, I think. It's a bad sign of people getting somewhat complacent. So there are different explanations for why this has been so bad. And I hope it gets better. I hope it's going to get better soon, but it's been bad, especially if you include the recession and the period going into it. So we've got a kind of almost 10 years now of terrible economic performance, including the recession and the slow recovery. So what's the reason? And it's being debated. It gets part of the political debate, who's going to take the blame in the United States. And we're sort of seeing the same kind of things, maybe even worse in Europe. So one explanation focusing on the US is that this is what always happens after deep recessions and financial crises. You know, you had a terrible hit to the financial sector, terrible hit to the economy. You had the GDP falling rapidly, especially in the last part of 2008, early 2009. And so the claim is, and you'll hear this a lot, this is what you expect. You had this terrible jolt to the economy. Well, it turns out when you look at least American economic history, which is the most relevant for here, is that just not true. In fact, it's always been the case, in my experience, that the deeper the recession, and even if you include deep recessions that are associated with financial crises, the more rapid the recovery. And so, again, wait for the charts and you'll see proof of that. And so you can say, well, how Great Depression must have been an example, Taylor, a counter example to what you're saying. Well, yes, it was a long, long road back, but from the bottom, the first 2.5, 3 years until we had another recession were really much, much stronger than we've seen recently. And I mentioned the early 80s, it just goes back many, many years into the past. Another explanation is housing, right? This was a real jolt to housing, and how can you have a strong recovery when housing's not growing very much? Well, if you look at most recoveries, some sectors are weak and some sectors are strong. In the 1980s expansion, 83, 84, 85, there was a real drag on the economy on foreign trade because the dollar was so strong. Basically, it was a drag. It's been much more positive in this recovery. So every recovery has its strengths and weaknesses. It seems to me you can't really blame any one sector. Some people say deleveraging. You ran up all this debt. It's going to take a while to reduce it, and as it gets reduced, you're going to have people saving too much, not going to consume. That's going to make the recovery slow. Well, that also doesn't add up. I mean, surprisingly, if you look at savings rates, how much people are saving, they're actually saving relatively little now compared to, say, the 1980s expansion. And that means that doesn't really hold up as a very good explanation. So you go through all these possibilities, and I have been doing that, and what I do is come to the conclusion that it's really policy that's going on. Policy is the issue, and thank you. Policy is the issue, and I want to be able to show that and talk about that a little bit. So for me, and this goes to this book, First Principles, that Bruce mentioned, for me, one way to explain this to people is just to explain the way in which policy has not been working well. You can't just say it's policy. You just can't assert that. You got to sort of describe why it's the case, and then also show that it's different now than it was in better periods, say like in the 80s and 90s, okay? So the way I've thought to do this, and it's related to my teaching of economics over the years, is just to say, look, what does basic economics tell us? And how can I explain that to people who are not economists? And I think of this idea as these first principles. And effectively, first principles are just the principles of economic freedom also. That's what I've taught my the first year, the freshman students for many, many years, not exactly in this way. But for me, the principles of economic freedom is obviously going to take us to Hayek pretty soon. They're basically a situation where people are free to about what they're going to buy, what they're going to sell, where they're going to work, who they're going to hire, how they're going to help other people. They're free to decide that, but there's this framework of principles they do that within. And first on my list is predictable policy. You have to know what the policy is. Second on the list is the rule of law. It's very close to that. You need to know what the rules are, whether it's private property or how you're going to be treated in a bankruptcy, or how you're going to be treated, if your invention is going to be treated. So the rule of law is number 2. Number 3 is focus on markets. And number 4, you get good incentives, especially if you look on markets. So 4 is incentives, and 5 is a limited role for government. And for me, it's straightforward. Limited role of government is just to use cost-benefit analysis to decide what government should be doing and what it shouldn't be doing. Of course, cost-benefit analysis is a huge can of worms, and also you get all sorts of results. But in principle, that's what you're talking about. By limiting government, limiting the role of the federal government, getting which part of government should be doing what it should be doing, but you use cost-benefit analysis. So those are the 5 principles. Now, in many respects, I think this country, the United States, has benefited greatly from kind of a broad adherence to these principles over its history, since its founding. And that's why we've done well. That's why people come to the United States. Why people still come to the United States for the most part is these principles, which I am calling economic freedom, and I'm defining in these 5 ways. Not the only way to do it, but it seems to me that's a good characterization. Now, if you look at shorter periods of time than U.S. history, you'll see swings back and forth, and greater and less amount of adherence to the principles. And those swings actually correlate a lot with good performance and bad performance. That's my observation. And so I want to just sort of think about the last 50, 60 years. This is actually, if you like, kind of post road to freedom, post capitalism and freedom. What have we learned by these swings back and forth? just look at some of these charts to sort of describe what I'm talking about. So this is just real GDP growth rate quarter to quarter back to the late 1940s in the United States. When it goes below zero for, you want to sit back? When it goes below zero, especially for more than a couple or so quarters, it's a recession. You can see the zero line here. These are quarterly growth rates, quarterly growth at annual rates. So you can see quite a bit of differences. The lines that I've drawn there mark what economists call the Great Moderation, and you can see there's much more stability in this period. Is remarkable. You had two very mild recessions in that period. And then, of course, you have the Great Recession here. That's really bad, like but things we've seen before. Worse in some sense, it's a little more extended. And then finally, you have what I was talking about is this very weak recovery compared, say, to the 1980s recovery. Okay, so the bad news is post-Great Moderation, depends on when you want to market, is not good economic performance. And then let's look at just some more details of the what's going on in the two ovals. Here's just another picture of that. This is the growth rate coming out of the recession that ended in the fourth quarter of 1982. Fourth quarter of 1982 is the end of that recession, and you see the expansion in terms of growth rates quarter by quarter. That's the red, and that's averaged in this case of 5 1/4, and the blue is what we've had in the expansion, the 14 quarters since this expansion began. Most recent data. Sometimes growth rates are not the only way to think of things, so this is just looking at GDP itself. To me, you see the capability of the economy is growing. That's our potential GDP measure, and that's an estimate by the Congressional Budget Office. I think it's reasonable. We don't know exactly what it is. It's based on technology growth projections and labor force growth projections. And then you have actual real GDP, which plummeted in the recession and basically has been growing. There's a recovery, but it's not taking us back to any degree of normal levels. And you compare that with the 1980s, you see the recession, the gap is about the same distance. Actually, there were back-to-back recessions, and then you see the sort of recovery back to potential. And then in terms of employment, I mentioned, this is another way to think about this, is you can look at unemployment, but that has problems because people drop out of the labor force. For example, the unemployment rate just went down because so many people dropped out of the labor force. So one way to just think about this without worrying about labor force is just to look at what fraction of the population that's able to work, working age population, is actually working. And this shows you the change in the working age population after those two recessions. Red line, you can see there's a big increase in the percentage of people that are working. And in this case, in the 42 or 43 months since the recession ended, it's actually going nowhere. There's no takeoff at all. In fact, it's lower than it was at the start of the recovery. So this is kind of bad news for the labor markets and another characterization of the problems in the economy. Now, I mentioned that there's the theory that this has happened because it was a deep recession and a financial crisis, and that's going to be debated forever, but this is sort of my evidence that's not really the way to think about it. So these are the growth rates following recessions that go back to 1882, and these particular recessions are designated by economic historians, Michael Bordo in particular, as things that are financial crisis related, but also many of them are quite deep. And if you think about the history and you're looking at the recoveries, the green lines are the recoveries. Okay, so the average, this is now looking at the first 8 quarters of expansion after the recession. The average of those green bars is the blue line, and that's just about 6%. And of course, that compares to the roughly 2% more recently. So you just can't write this off as it's because we had a deep recession. And so that brings me, those are some of the charts, that brings me to this idea of these principles. So now you can actually see them. I just said them. using the modern technology. You can put them on the screen very quickly, but there's the predictable framework, rule of law, strong incentives that come largely from the market system and a limited role for government. As I mentioned, those have been attractive features of the United States. And as other countries have gotten close to this, they have improved. Now, I think there's been shifting winds over time, and that's where I left off before we got the computer going again. In particular, I think the 60s and 70s represented a swing away from these principles. So just think about it. That was the period where we had start with macro, extraordinarily interventionist, unpredictable monetary policy. Go, stop, it was called. It was basically misconstrued what monetary policy should do. It, of course, led to that high inflation and really very high unemployment. Fiscal policy, was really in the mid-60s, actually early 60s, the idea of these Keynesian interventionist policies came to Washington. The Economic Report of the President in 1962, one of the best pieces of persuasive economic writing around, but tried to make the case of we needed to have a very active fiscal policy. And it began in the 60s, different directions. There was a temporary tax surcharge at the end of the 60s, and there was a stimulus, a rebate, President Ford. There was a stimulus package to the states by President Carter. President Nixon talked about we're all Keynesians now. And so it got to very activist fiscal policy. I would say not rules-based, in my perspective, maybe sounds pejorative, very unpredictable. Think about forgetting about markets. Nixon imposed wage and price controls on the entire economy. How far can you get away from these principles when you're doing that kind of thing? Regulations really began to move up at that time, so you're seeing really an increased role for government. So all the things I'm mentioning here are moving in the wrong direction. And in a way, it's interesting, it's kind of all of these together. It's not just monetary policy, somehow they're all moving together. And so that's the shifting away. Then there was this shifting back, I think of it, and began in the late 70s. It, to some extent, began because people got disgusted with the poor economic performance and just wanted something different. But it really took hold in the 80s, and I think lasted basically until recently. I don't know exactly when, but into the 2000s. And you can see this in many ways. Monetary policy got away from the go stop and said, here's a strategy, we're going to reduce inflation, and that was Volcker. Huge pressure on him. He was appointed by Carter, as you know. This is really not a partisan presentation, even in any way, shape, or form. Presented by Carter, and he basically got away from that kind of policy, which led to the problems. Under huge pressure to ease when unemployment got so high, he would go on to the news shows, and they'd ask him, what about unemployment? And Mr. Chairman said, well, we got to get inflation down. That's what I can't get our eye off the ball on that, and he did, and as a result, things looked a lot better. Fiscal policy, we completely got away from the Keynesian stimulus approach. Unemployment was high. There were really, even early, people were pretty sick of it at that time, I think. They saw President Carter's advisors, after they left, wrote that those stimulus packages didn't work. And by the way, President Ford's advisors, I was one of them at the time, wrote that didn't work afterwards. So it was sort of, we shouldn't be doing that fiscal policy. Instead, we basically just had a proposal to reduce tax rates and keep it there, steady as you go type of policy. Regulatory policy started to come down. I think I have a chart of that. We can look at it in a minute. And so, you know, the last remnants of the price and wage controls were removed from the energy sector. And things obviously got a lot better through this period. So it seems to me there's a reason to believe that there's something to this change in policy. And then finally you have this veering away again more recently. Don't know exactly when to pinpoint this change. I think monetary policy really lost the focus in 2003, 4, and 5. Took rates very low, stimulated this housing boom and the excessive risk-taking. And ever since then, and I have a chart to show that, the more recent period, it has deviated from any kind of sense of rules or predictability. Fiscal policy, we had a stimulus package in 2001, people forget. It was put in place as sort of an advance payment on these permanent tax reductions. But then we had a stimulus package in 2008 and a gigantic one in 2009. They're just the kind of things that economists wrote about in the late 70s as not being very helpful. And we sort of got back to all that. So monetary policy, fiscal policy, and of course with the, say for example, the financial reform bill, Dodd-Frank, a huge number of more regulations. And so in a way we veered away again. And so to me, in a way, it's not surprising why the performance has deteriorated as in a broad sweep of things. So a few just charts to show, well, first of all, I think this is just a little schematic. Does this improve anything? Just a schematic of what I just talked about. So this is the unemployment rate in the United States. You can see the ups and downs in the business cycle, but then you can see these broader movements corresponding to times I was talking about. So you have this period of this interventionist deviations from the principles, unemployment basically rising. And you see the change in the early 80s sometimes where you want to market, and it's come down. And then you see the more recent period. So again, this doesn't prove it. It's just a simple way to remember what I just said. Using the unemployment rate, you could look at other things as well. Here's a little chart to just show you how interventionist fiscal policy has become. Just to remind you, this is all well known. This is personal income, disposable personal income in the United States, first from 2007 to 2010. And you can see the 2008 stimulus, we sent checks to people. There's a gigantic increase. That was supposed to get the economy moving again. And then we had the 2009 stimulus. It doesn't look like such a peak because it's spread out a little bit more. We can identify that as whether it's due to the stimulus or not based on data that the Department of Commerce produces. So I know those are stimulus effects. And those are supposed to jumpstart consumption. They didn't, at least in this chart, didn't do anything. And when you look more detailed, which is appropriate, you look at the statistics, it doesn't seem to have done much at all. This is actually just what Milton Friedman would have told us, the permanent income hypothesis, or Franklin Modigliani with the life cycle hypothesis. So it's sort of these spurts of trying to do things, and even if they have a little impact, they diminish over time. And we did these things, and they never sort of create sustained recovery. One of the really amazing things is the cash for clunkers. That was advertised as a real big thing to get the economy moving. You give money to people, and if they sold in their cash, they sold in their clunker, gas guzzler, and bought a new car. And this is an estimate of the impact of that, which is ridiculous, really. Blown up version of that little thing, and you know, yes, it worked. You got people to buy some cars a little earlier than otherwise. They just moved it up a few months, so that couldn't possibly be something to get the economy going. But it was many articles written about the advantage of that. Okay, another measure of unpredictable policy. This is the tax code, number of provisions expiring. So it's a measure of the lack of permanence in the tax code. The missing years is because they didn't collect the data. This comes from the Congress. And you can see we've had a huge increase in the number. And I think I put a little bar in here just to remind you that, in fact, the so-called fiscal cliff of the end of last year is kind of the mother of all unpredictability. You had the entire tax code was going to be up for grab. That's just not good policy. It's against these principles. So another reason to think about monetary policy, no, regulatory policy. So this is the one measure of our regulatory policy is moving against the principles. You need to have regulation. This is a measure that suggests it's increasing too rapidly. Just the number of federal workers employed in regulatory activities. I excluded TSA. Some of you might think I shouldn't have, but it would be worse if I did. And that compares to what happened in the 80s, early 80s. We were basically going to sort of moving away from that. It was a big expansion in the 70s. And it's not so much the lower is the important thing, it's going in the other direction. Here's the monetary policy ones. Just go through this quickly. This is a lot of going on here, but this is one way to represent the interventions by monetary policy. monetary policy, I think, always has a role to play in sort of lender of last resort in the crisis. And one way to measure that is how much liquidity the Fed has put into the economy. One measure of liquidity is how much the banks have as reserve at the Fed. So this is bank reserves at the Fed. And you can see in 9/11, well, you can't see in 9/11, but it's there. It was $60 billion of support. So that's $60 billion. I was in the government then. We were just so amazed. That was 9/11, the physical damage to lower Manhattan. And so the Fed pumped on this money, but then took it out really quickly. And then you had the panic in 2008, and yes, those markets froze up, so some support would be appropriate, I think. Rules-based policy would suggest that. And so you had this increase, it was gigantic, it's about $800 billion. And my counterfactual is what would have happened if they just let it at that. Well, that's not what happened. This is what happened. So they went out and bought treasuries and bought mortgage-backed securities, and that's the blue line, and then the red line is what's going to happen if they continue with the policy that they're on now until unemployment reaches 6.5%. I hope they don't do that, but the main thing is here, this is kind of unprecedented, unpredictable. You can't think of a rule. It's basically do whatever it takes. It may be the right thing to do. I don't think so, but it's not consistent with those principles that I mentioned. I think that's basically, well, just maybe one more thing. This is the impacts of the fiscal policy on the debt, and this is debt to GDP ratio for the United States, going back to the founding of our country. And this is a CBO projection. You can see World War II. That for most of my life, that was a gigantic thing we talk about. Now it looks relatively small in comparison to at least where we're going. In 2009, CBO projected if we didn't change the law, the debt to GDP ratio go according to the black line. The United States of America will not be the United States of America as that happens. 2012, the most recent projection, is exactly the same, except they just stopped reporting the numbers and they got above 250. There's no progress, just didn't report the numbers, but it's the same thing. So we're stuck in this problem, and hopefully we'll work something out. Now, to me, and I don't want to spend more time on this, but to me, the implications of all this are very clear. You have historical evidence, you have economic theory, you have evidence for particular interventions. They all seem to me suggest that it would be most helpful if we got back to these principles, okay? And that means on the monetary policy, fiscal policy, regulatory policy, the healthcare law, the financial reform, all those things are moving in the wrong direction. So I think, I don't know what we're going to do is we got to get back to it. So that brings me to the Hayek connection again. I'll skip that. I think that there's many ways in which the kind of things that Hayek has written about help us get back. They also help us think about the principles that I wrote down. Obviously, those just didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of, they're related to the things that Hayek wrote about. So I think it can help us get back on the principles, help us implement them in today, which the world changes. So you want to stick to your principles, I think, but when you apply them, the world is different. So you got to figure out how you're going to do that. So I have along these lines, consider how 4 or 5 reasons, 5 or 6 reasons, how Hayek's writings can help. Okay, this is reason number 1. So as I mentioned at the beginning, for me, and I think for a lot of sort of macroeconomists, the rule of law and policy predictability probably hasn't been stressed as much as it should be, say, in the principles courses or what we're teaching. Markets, limited government, incentives all over the place. But rule of law, you probably your own experience. Rule of law, predictability probably a little less so. And one way we found out that that was a mistake is what happened with, say, the Soviet Union falling apart. When markets are going to come, it's going to be great, but rule of law wasn't there, and so you're not getting as good a progress as you'd like. The cronyism is severe. corruption is severe. So Hayek, he didn't downplay these. And so I have this quote. This is from Road Serfdom. I'll just read it because to me it's the fact that we have not emphasized this, and we should emphasize it seems so important. Nothing distinguishes more clearly conditions in a free country from those in a country under arbitrary government than the observance in the former of the great principles known as the rule of law. Stripped of all technicalities, this means that government in all its actions is bound by rules, fixed, announced beforehand, rules which make it possible to foresee with fair certainty how the authority will use its coercive powers in given circumstances and plan one's individual affairs on the basis of this knowledge. So this is exactly the kind of things that we have found, I think, especially in these swings back and forth, are so important from the point of view of economic policy. And perhaps because people have not read Hayek enough, has not been emphasized. And I don't think you're hearing much about this as an important thing if you're listening to the dialogue in Washington. To me, it's very important. It's one of the reasons why I hate all the quantitative easing that's going on. It's just basically kind of so much against the notion of announced beforehand rules, fair certainty, how the coercive powers, et cetera. It just fits into that. So that's sort of reason number one why to read it. Reason number two. A lot of what I read of Hayek in the idea of rule of law, it was in some sense only partly a better way to get good policy. It's also a way to preserve, give, allow freedom in general, not just economic freedom. So as I said, my research is focused on this as more stability and growth, but Hayek's much more than that. And I think a lot of this is in the Constitution of Liberty. I have a couple quotes here. One is his results of going back in the history of political thought. He quotes Cicero. No other author shows more clearly that freedom is dependent upon certain attributes of the law. Freedom is dependent on attributes of the law, its generality and certainty, and the restrictions it places on the discretion of authority. So we're thinking about the restrictions on the discretion is beneficial to the economy, but he's quoting Cicero. He's quite clear that this is a way to preserve freedom, if you like, the rights of the minority or the rights of the individual, the laws of what can and can't be done. And he quotes Locke, the meaning, the end, which for Locke means the meaning of the law is not to abolish or restrain or preserve and enlarge freedom. Where there is no law, there is no freedom. So this is something which I hadn't thought much about, and I think in some sense sometimes counterintuitive. How did the rules, why are rules helping with economic freedom? But if you think about it, history is a very important part of it. Constitution of liberty seems to me conveys that idea. Now, it's also in line of trying to get back on track with policy, seems to me useful, because what this means is kind of maybe a coalition, you could think about, a coalition of people who are concerned about freedom, and they want the predictability and the rule of law. And there's other people who want economic growth, they want stability and growth, and they should be concerned about it. So perhaps this would be a way, and maybe if you think about the political dialogue that's coming around in the US and maybe eventually in other places, it seems to me that say the Fed, some of the concerns of what the Fed's doing are just an inherent concern about the ability for a independent agency of government to say penalize savers. So, is that right? Well, they have reasons to do it, but those low rates seem to be doing that. So there's this inherent concern for people who are interested in political freedom to move back towards some kind of rule of law, and maybe that will help, if you like, move in the direction which I think is appropriate. Reason number three. This seems to me one of the trickiest issues for public policy, and you can see it recently a lot. So there's a tremendous temptation for government officials to do something. And I think if you think about some of the stuff that Hayek has written, you realize that if you interpret the rules properly, it doesn't mean you don't do anything. It means you do things. And so that's the tricky part. Anyway, so the reason to read Hayek here, reason 3, is it will tell you rules don't mean you don't do anything. So government officials, I worked in government myself, are always under pressure to do something, to intervene. And in fact, my good friend and mentor in many respects, George Shultz, he calls it the urge to intervene. And he's served in 4 different cabinet posts. He knows the drill. And it can come politically. It can come because of risk. In a financial crisis, the urge to bail out is very high, because if you're worried about the financial system falling apart, it may be the wrong thing to do, but you're going to intervene in that way. And so that causes that kind of a urge. And if you say, well, if you have a rule in your strategy, you're not doing anything. They get with it. You know, it doesn't seem like it's the right thing. So Hayek addresses this, and this quote is from The Road to Serfdom, and he basically tries to say there's this confusion. This is a confused view, confusion about the nature of this system, that is, the laws or rules, and the belief that its characteristic attitude is inaction. So he wants to argue, no, the characteristic attitude is not inaction. It means not do anything. It doesn't mean don't do anything. And so there's various examples, but the one that I recall right now is law enforcement. You may have a strategy for a city or a town, state or whatever, to deal with crime. So you have a police force, you have the rules that they have to obey, wait enough people to get arrested or detect the crime. And that's your strategy, and that's your, if you like, the rule of law, okay? It doesn't mean that the police just sit there. It means they go out and get the bad guys. It doesn't mean that the courts don't try people. They do it all the time. So there's a lot of doing that's going on. And the trick here seems to be for government officials or politicians to sort of stress that part of this, not stress the do nothing part, but stress that we're doing a lot. We just want to change the strategy. The tactics maybe would have changed a little bit. Maybe the police should go into this neighborhood rather than that, but it's not really changing the overall strategy. Monetary policy, I think, is similar, so I'm interested in policy rules for monetary policy, and one of the rules is the interest rate should change under certain circumstances. Okay, it doesn't mean the Fed doesn't do anything. It raises the interest rates or lowers the interest rate under certain circumstances, but it's kind of it's not going to change its rule. It's not going to do all the quantitative easing or something like that. So if the discussion is in the terms of, if you like, maybe implementing, I think at least part of this urge to intervene or pressure to do something can be resisted. Based on experience, and also reading the fact that Hayek was quite worried about this in his writings. And one just little side here, and you could also say that there's, in a crisis, there's always going to be temptation to do something. So the world's changed, you got to do something different. These damn rules are useless, that kind of thing. But in many respects, that's the worst time to deviate, because people don't know what's going on. If you add a huge amount of uncertainty to what the government is doing, you're making it worse. So maybe that's just a side point here. Reason number 4, who gets us in and out of these messes? The chapter in The Road to Serfdom, Why the Worst Get to Get on Top, I guess it is, Why the Worst Get on Top. Very thoughtful concerns, and there's this bias in some sense against people. I say principled here, it's just a short for principles of economic freedom, taking positions, because there's that's not the way to, you want to have people who are going to do something. You want to have people that maybe they can bend the corners to help the cronies. They can do that. So there's a tendency for them not to get to the top. So actually, if you look at some history here, I think you can see the extent to which the way people have tried to overcome this. One is to look for people who are kind of overly committed to the principles, then there'll be less tendency to bend. Think of Richard Nixon. He bent huge, right, for political reasons. So if you had someone who was more overly committed, then that may be less of a problem. But then you can also see kind of the way that a couple people here, Reagan and Thatcher, really pushed in very strong, almost extreme ways, these principles compared to alternatives. And it's interesting to me, if you look at the appointees of Reagan in the economics areas, almost everybody's from Chicago. In the Treasury, Council of Economic Advisors. In the period of Reagan, not one member of the Council of Economic Advisors had their PhDs from Harvard or MIT. Not one, that period. And it's completely opposite now. I mean, just in Bush, Obama, I don't know the last appointee, 100% are from Harvard or MIT. I love Harvard and MIT, but it's just the example of kind of a shifting, if you like, from a philosophy. And Thatcher, very famous, when she's speaking to the conservative analysts who were arguing for really, I think, kind of a compromise view, she brings out this book. It's the story, brings it out of her purse and slams it on the table and says, "This is what we believe." That's pretty amazing for a leader of a party to do that. As you know, Keynes had a much different view of this. Figured in his positive statement to Hayek about the road to serfdom, he adds that he's not as worried as Hayek about the people. You just appoint good people, is what Keynes argued. You just appoint good people, it'll be okay. So that's quite a different view, and in a sense, it's almost like Keynes did not read that chapter of Road to Serfdom. I don't know. And it was a famous, experts like Bruce know this inside out, but it seems to me it's indicative of this lesson that you can learn. Reason number 5, this is more of a just observing Hayek himself. It shows you, I think, how difficult this can be. Even those who support the principles can sometimes get off track for political pressures or maybe the heat of the moment. And in the 1970s, it seems to me that Hayek himself, with respect to monetary policy, became a little wobbly, say. And did sort of say, well, we maybe need some discretion in monetary policy. The 70s were a tough time, remember. Inflation was very high. People didn't know quite what was going on. But Milton Friedman objected to this and wrote a letter to Hayek. And I hate to see you come out as you do here for what I believe to be one of the most fundamental violations of the rule of law that we have, namely discretionary activities of central bankers. So even, to the extent that Friedman is correct here, which I sympathize with, even the best can fall into this situation. So that's another thing to learn. Learn from the experience of Hayek. And then finally, just to end with this, we have a few questions. I think, as you know, we are having a problem now. And is it anything like the assault that Hayek was warning about? Well, you may have this bumper sticker. I've got the bumper sticker, "We're on the road to serfdom" right now. And so I think there's some similarities. And it's really another reason that, you read this and it sounds like it's ancient history. This never happened, perhaps because of Hayek himself. But it seems to me that there's analogies. So, central planning. The Independent Payment Advisory Board for the healthcare law basically sets up people who are going to control the total amount of spending on healthcare, say Medicare. And how are they going to do that? They're going to set the price, they're going to set the quantity, they're going to set the quality of healthcare. It's not the whole economy, it's a big part of the economy. Maybe this won't happen, but that's really what the law says at this point. How far different is that from setting prices and quantities and qualities for the whole economy? Forward guidance, what I mean by forward guidance, in monetary policy, the Fed is saying they're going to hold the short-term interest rate to 0 for a number of years. That drives the long-term interest rate to particular values. It's almost like a price control. It's almost like a rent control, if you like, on those interest rates. So it seems to me that's very similar if you think about it. And this word industrial policy I used in one of my first recent critiques of the Fed. And by the way, I was the biggest supporter of the Fed in the good period. Industrial policy is obviously a combination of industrial policy and monetary policy, where the Fed creates money and uses it to, say, invest in a firm, support a firm, or support a market, like the mortgage market. And so it seems to me these are all, if you like, things that are moving in the wrong direction, and they're, in a way, I don't want to, make it exaggerate too much, but they're all in the direction of the things that I had warned about when he was writing. Let me stop there.
Okay. Well, I think we do have some time for some questions, so the floor will be open.
Can I start? So I do have a question. Let's say that we implement these 5 principles. What kind of economy do you think we would have, say, a couple of generations from now, assuming that we stick to these principles and we don't suffer any significant shocks? And as a related question, to what extent does the increasing concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands affect the ability of those principles to do what they may be able to do?
So the first thing I'd say, things would be much better. You can look at the history, look at the 80s and 90s. You have fewer recessions, stronger growth. Your question addresses the income distribution. And here, I've thought a lot about this. I haven't put it out here, but during these different phases of recent American history, we had basically strong growth from the 50s to the mid-60s. Then in the mid-60s to 70s, growth was low. It was low for both the top and the bottom. The growth rate of the 10%, same as the growth of 9%. And then they slowed down for both. And then in the 80s, which is what I'm considering 80s and 90s until recently, the relatively good period, I think the growth rate increased a lot, and we had more stability, and unemployment was down. That was good for those at the bottom. But the income distribution shifted, and you had faster growth for the top 10% and very little for the 90%. And then since around 2000, so-called bad period in my characterization, there's been little growth for either. So that basically the share of income of the top 1 or 10% is almost the same now as it was it's actually lower now than it was in the year 2000. And the 90% or 99%, however you want to do it, is also not getting any better. So the anomaly here is the 80s. But the policy got better by my definition, but it didn't spread. It didn't help everybody. And so to me, the explanation I have for that is these principles didn't apply to everybody. I call it economic freedom for all was missed. And you can say, no, it's because of taxes, it's because of not enough regulation, we should be supporting less economic freedom. There's too much competition or not enough regulation, and there's a view. But it seems to me that what happened is we're moving back to economic freedom principles pretty well. But what about the kids in the center cities who can't get to a school? What about the kids that their freedom has not been helped? Their opportunities are not been helped. So I think basically that to answer your question, if you really want to deal with that problem, and I do, I think it's not a good situation. You want to get the economic freedom for everybody. And so that means however you want to improve the life of people who are basically unable to improve their parents want to improve their lives, they can't go to a school, they feel like the government is restricting what they can do. So that's how I think about that. Over here, yeah.
When you were speaking about quantitative easing, QE, the latest one, the $80 billion a month. So they're buying that portfolio. And person who, or the collection of people that now have cash in off the portfolio, they're going to buy something else. Are they enabling, I've read where, are they enabling $1 billion of stock purchases a day in the New York Stock Exchange by this $80 billion of removing one portfolio, now a new portfolio is created. There's $1 billion a day going into the New York Stock Exchange buying stocks. It's not a value proposition, it's not a great.
Yeah. So I don't know how much it's affecting the stock market. Must be to some extent. It's affecting the long-term bond market, I'm pretty sure. But it seems to me it's not a healthy situation where many people in Wall Street think the market depends on the Fed, depends on the government. It should not. There's something wrong there, as I think about it. And one thing that's wrong is it's got to be undone at some point. Are we going to depend on quantitative easing for the next 100 years to have, prosperity? No, I don't think anyone wants that. But how are we going to get out of it? So I've done studies of the impact on the mortgage market. It seems to be small, but it must be having some effect somewhere. They can't quantify it very well. There's huge debates now about how to undo it and whether they should undo it. So I actually think it's a drag now on the economy, even if it's helping the stock market. It seems to me we still got this, last year, growth was 2%, 2012. The Fed forecast the year before it was going to be 4%. So they're basically, what they do, all this stuff is not helping. I mean, they can say, oh, something else is going on here that makes it harder for us, but it seems to me there's not a lot of hard evidence that's positive, and so that's why I put it on my list of negative. There's more evidence that's negative. Yeah?
It seems to me that there's a piece of Hayek you're missing here that, without reading that, you don't really get the understanding of the constitutional liberty that you should get, and that is the socialist calculation debate material, use of knowledge in society in the 1930s, early 1940s period. Everything you say about the rule of law and individual planning and so on with respect to decision making is true, but what you don't get if you just read constitutional liberty is you don't get the idea that activist monetary policy, activist fiscal policy are all instances of central planning and are doomed to fail because they suffer from all the knowledge problems and the pretenses of knowledge that are part of central planning. And all necessarily, I mean, if you read Hayek, that period, they all necessarily, including and maybe especially monetary policy, business cycle work, all are going to generate inefficiencies and dislocations in the economy. So it's not just, well, you need a rule of law, any rule of law, so people can plan their, how they invest next year because they know what tax policy is going to be. But you have, at that other piece, you need the rule of law, in some sense, a correct rule of law, so that you're avoiding all the central planning problems. And so if you don't emphasize reading that along with the constitutional liberty, I guess is the point.
No, I appreciate that.
That
Yeah,
you sort of miss a big chunk of the piece. And I think, to be frank, I think students these days need to read that, especially economics majors, that as much as they need to read the constitutional liberty.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's the idea of the markets are providing information about through prices, they're allocating resources, the use of knowledge in society. View, I think that's important. I didn't stress it enough. I mean, in a way, quantitative easing makes it very clear there's a problem there. The central government is affecting a particular price. So I agree. I appreciate the comment.
Okay, we have time for one
Sorry.
more?
Yeah, you're a specialist in international economics. That was your post in government, wasn't it?
Yes.
A political scientist looks at the last 30 years, or even at the present, and he sees at the end of this year $4 trillion of corporate money abroad, untaxed, such here, waiting for an amnesty. He sees 50% of S&P earnings earned abroad. When you look closely at the Reagan period, the way I have, the market went up from the bottom, the market went up 4 times, just as it went up the same amount under Thatcher. But the problem in the late 70s was was that you were getting the wage inflation. Suddenly from 85 on, everybody says there's going to be a big deficit and big inflation. There's no inflation to go with that deficit and weight that. But instead, wages are extremely flat. You know, you don't go back at all to the wage inflation, you know, which is clearly associated with lack of inflation. And the question is, political scientists have the sense that something must have changed with outsourcing, with computerization, with flow of money, of capital by a click of the button, by immigration, which affects wage levels. And one is a specialist in international economics. Does any of this cause any problems to you? And if the world changes as drastically as it has in 1980 in these realms, when is the time that you would say, or Hayek would say, it's time to change the rules, at least so far as this part of the pie is concerned?
Well, I think the rules, I mean, the S&P 500 profits being half from abroad, that's reflecting the fact that the rest of the world is doing much better, it seems to me right now. Basically, it's another reason why the stock market's doing better than the economy. But that's positive and I think consistent with these principles and with Hayek. I mean, why has China done so much better?
Not because they followed Hayek.
I disagree. I disagree. And let me say that obviously they haven't gone all the way, but they've gone closer from where they were. I mean, think of Mao, what was going on with Mao, and think of what Deng Xiaoping did. And he basically tried to get closer to those principles. It's a huge way to go. But don't say that China is successful because they moved away from the principles. And even think of it now. The income distribution. There's this big talk about China's got to address the income distribution. How are they addressing it? If you think about it, well, they're going to allow property rights for people coming to the city. They're going to allow firms to pay dividends to people. Actually, their solution to income distribution is what I think ours should be, is to move closer to the principles. So I think that, you know, it's obviously silly to say China's got a good rule of law and all those things. They've got a long way to go, but it's so much better than the tragedy that was going on with Mao before then. So I think I'd say in terms of international more generally, another issue that comes up here is if we continue to deviate from these principles, we're going to continue to lose the influence in the world. I mean, say we, I'm sorry, I mean the United States. We're going to lose that influence, and I don't think there's anyone to replace us at this point. The Europeans are not ready, China's not ready. So I'm not being chauvinistic. The reality is that through all this period, the U.S. has stressed open markets and trade, and for that matter, economic freedom has been a big message that we broadcast. Political freedom too, and so that's been beneficial. Maybe that's one of the reasons why China eventually moved, and other countries. I mean, think this is enormous benefits in the emerging markets now. Emerging markets did much better than we did in the crisis. They're doing much better than us now. So I think, to me, that's all consistent with the message of moving more in this direction.
Okay. Well, that's the end of our time.
Okay.
So thank you very much.